Around the time when version 4 was underway, I made a video in which I posited that Genshin Impact was about to approach a new phase within its metagame, one that would drastically alter the way players go about building their teams and evaluating units for the coming years. After releasing the likes of Lini, Nevalette, and Risley, these characters placed more emphasis on powering up their own personal damage output, contrasting from most of version 3's characters who primarily focused on stuff like application or elemental reaction playstyles. In line of that, I postulated that Genshin would be progressing towards more of a hypercarry meta, in which we'd be seeing teams built around optimizing one character's DPS to the best of their ability. Not only was that theory proven true later in version 4, but version 5 made it all the more so, with damn near every character, whether DPS or support, playing into a vertical investment win condition, including and especially the two strongest attackers in the game. Coinciding with that sequence of events, units who were primarily built on reaction-based teams began to decline at an exceedingly alarming rate, not the least of which Dendro dropping off considerably in meta relevance despite once being considered the most powerful DPS element throughout the entirety of version 3. Nanlan did a lot to elucidate the long-standing issues with Genshin's character balance on both ends, the problems affecting vertical carries and the problems affecting reaction carries. But with the arrival of units like Ineffa, Lauma, Flins, and soon Nefer, I wanted to make a video talking about the direction Genshin's meta is currently headed, and more importantly discuss how they can best go about it without making the same mistakes that they did before. If it wasn't abundantly apparent yet, in light of the excessive dominance of hypercarries throughout versions 4 and 5, reaction-based units have been struggling to keep up with the meta, as evident by reaction units once considered among the best of the best like Nahida to barely be in contention for top 10 during Nanlan. To better explain where I'm going with this, we should open up by establishing what exactly is a vertical carry compared to a reaction one. Genshin's elemental reactions are divided into two types. Amplifying reactions consist of any reaction whose damage output is based on the attack that triggered the reaction, multiplying the damage dealt. For example, if a 10k damage pyro attack activated Vaporize on a hydro-marked enemy, it would do 1.5 times more damage, or 15k. Transformative reactions, on the other hand, deal an additional amount of damage irrespective of how much the ensuing attack does, effectively being its own instance of damage, although it does scale out the user's elemental mastery. The idea is that one's predicated on power, the other is predicated on frequency. To maximize an amplifying reaction's damage, the triggering attack wants to be as strong as possible to then benefit from that multiplier. To maximize a transformative reaction's damage, you want to trigger the reaction itself as much as possible. In the early days of the game, circa version 1 and 2, amplifying reactions were at the top of the metagame since players had yet to create optimal teams. Vertical investment parties were more straightforward to build. All you needed was some hydro or cryo, and then a pyro attack, and then you were good to go. You then just had to juice up the main attacker with any kind of buffs you could find like Bennett, Kosuha, and so on. But transformative reaction teams had a number of advantages that allowed them to excel in the mid-years of Genshin. Early instances of the Taster team proved to be highly effective in mobbing scenarios by combining large AoEs like Sucrose with a steady stream of damage, continuously overlaying Hydro and Electro together. By virtue of the inherent base damage afforded by Electro Charge and the number of characters that could play into it, players could achieve a strong minimum damage output without having to consider what characters were activating it. Sucrose, Fischl, Xingqiu, and Beidou could contribute a nice amount of damage individually and then supplement their DPS collectively through reactions. Version 3 took that a step further by adding Bloom and Quicken to the mix, giving units even more ways to apply elements and pump out loads of DPS. The DPS floor of Hyper Bloom in particular was so high that a team like Xingqiu, Kale, Shinobu, and Fischl could potentially outdamage a version 1 carry team like Ganyu Freeze, giving rise to the elemental reaction meta spanning the majority of 2023. For the most part, people accepted this happily as it led to the game being extremely free-to-play friendly. You could break the most of the endgame using all 4-star units even better than you could before, and it was part of the reason the community saw the game as power creep resistant. Not to say vertical investment wasn't a thing, there just had yet to be enough infrastructure to create a team with a high enough and more crucially practical ceiling to merit putting in the resources over simply running a Hyperbloom team. As you know though, over time said infrastructure did begin to appear. The main thing holding back vertical investment was that we just didn't have characters with a strong enough baseline to compound on. But once version 4 came, not only did we get units like Nevalette, Arlecchino, Clorenz, Navia, Lini, and such, but supports were brought in that could better leverage the higher baseline, Farina and Xinyun. Theoretically, they could play into an elemental reaction, but their kits were more geared towards boosting their teammates, applying as many bonuses to the active character, if not the entire party, as they could. Combining these factors together, and we began to see vertical investment teams make progress on what they could do. Prior, it was all about doing high 5 figures worth of damage. Now we were starting to see 6 figures pretty consistently, with many version 4 units breaking into the top of the DPS charts. It's here where the main limitation of transformative reactions came into play, that they had a limit. because the damage of a reaction like Hyper Bloom is a standalone instance only affected by Elemental Mastery, there aren't that many ways you can increase its output. 1. You can't raise the base damage of a reaction. It's not based on your character's attack stat, for example. It's just a flat amount based on your level plus your Elemental Mastery. Being separate instances of damage, transformative reactions cannot critically strike, losing out on a potential increase right there. They also can't be increased by anything related to a person's own damage, including, say, Farina's Burst. Farina raises damage dealt by characters, but Hyper Bloom, Electrocharge, Quicken, etc. are technically not damage dealt by characters. They are a separate source of damage dealt. In essence, the only thing you can do to quote-unquote vertically invest in a reaction team is by either getting the party's elemental mastery as high as possible or increase the rate of application to trigger more of that reaction as possible. However, the rate of application is kept in check by the game's internal cooldown, preventing you from getting infinite reactions off. Putting it simply, transformative reactions have a higher floor than amplifying ones on account of being a flat amount of damage applied to enemies, but in exchange they have a lower ceiling than amplifying ones given there are only so many ways you can increase their damage. In version 1, amplifying reactions are doing great because we didn't have the application for a transformative team, but then reactions are buffed in 1.6 to be more in line with the amplifying ones. Shortly afterwards, versions 2 and 3 brought in more units who could play into a reaction team. Meanwhile, amplifying teams were struggling as a result of not getting new DPS or supports who can play into personal damage. Then, in version 4 and 5, we got tons of personal DPS and personal supports, pushing damage well into the 7-figure mark, all while reactions haven't been improving much, if at all. That is, until recently. With the inclusion of Ineffa came a new electrocharged reaction called Lunar Charge, an enhanced version of the original reaction that factors the stats of all contributing characters and their crit stats into the equation. In short, it's a transformative reaction that comes from the character, not a separate instance, thereby being allowed to deal increasingly higher amounts of damage. Furthermore, Lunar Charge is also regarded as a form of damage in and of itself, allowing units to directly augment Lunar Charge if they have a property that does so. Recently, we've begun to notice a rise in characters who buff elemental reaction damage itself, thereby adding ways to vertically invest into a transformative team. Though not a novel concept, as Mona, a version 1 character, had the ability to boost Hydro reaction damage by way of her C1, units who directly raised the base damage of reactions were few and far between, and certainly far from optimally designed. Now, however, with units like Ineffa and Lauma, reaction supports began to catch up to vertical ones. Firstly, they themselves deal more damage. Reaction supports of Volt were not extolled for their personal DPS output. Xingqiu, Sucrose, and Beidou, to name a few, did do some damage of their own, especially for the time they came out, but pragmatically you cared more about their application. A character like Ineffa, on the other hand, could actually deal meaningful damage of her own in addition to boosting the damage of reactions, building off each other. It's more visible in Lauma, who by all accounts is a direct upgrade to Nahida in Bloom teams. Lauma's elemental skill does considerable damage in its own right, rivaling that of the Dendro Archon when factoring in the built-in shred on top of it. Reaction-wise, her elemental burst quite literally busts the damage of reactions based on a portion of her elemental mastery, serving as a way for you to buff the strength of Bloom cores made by not just her, but anyone else. Moreover, her A1 passive grants her party the ability to make Bloom cores critically strike, something only possible with C2 Nahida beforehand. Though they're still mostly flat amounts, what matters is that we have more ways to elevate the DPS ceiling of transformative reactions than just elemental mastery and level. More units are coming out who can add more damage to reactions, make reactions critically strike, and so on. It should come to no one's surprise we're about to enter a reaction-focused meta again. Dendro's made a return to top form, with Lauma and Nefer being the first Dendro units we've had in almost a year. Meanwhile, Nefer and Flins are bringing more power into Electrocharge, a reaction we haven't seen much of since 2022. These characters have the same power budget as the version 5 hypercarries, but rather than playing exclusively into their own personal damage, they also moonlight in a reaction. Well, technically Flins is a hybrid of both. He's the main attacker who could be vertically invested into to some extent, but you're mostly trying to bring units who can apply a good amount of Hydro, Electro, and Anemo, Ineffa, Ino, and Sucrose being a sample team. Suffice to say, reactions are back in business, but unlike version 4, this isn't a shift in the meta per se. Non-Cry units don't vastly outperform hypercarry teams the way hypercarry teams took over the Dendro meta before. More that they've caught up to them, giving players the freedom to play either or without having to compromise in effectiveness. To a certain extent, you could say they made reactions more investable by creating units that could specifically raise the power of a reaction in ways not available before, thereby adding new amplifiers to the reaction equation. From personal experience, I'd say they've done a bang-up job. I've been messing around with the Lauma Nilo Bloom team, and I've seen Bloom cores do easily over 6-figure damage. But that aside, there are a few warning signs I think should be worth mentioning. Even though we've reached a point where hypercarry teams and reaction teams are roughly on par with each other, something I and my friends notice is that Hoyo hasn't really addressed the root problem affecting reactions. They're merely addressing the symptoms. Up till this point, the main problem with transformative reactions is that they're by all accounts a separate instance of damage with their primary emphasis on making up for lack of scaling through frequency, quantity over quality. That's where the vertical investment stands. Instead of making one electrocharge or bloom or overload do more damage, the idea is to get more of them, 2 electrocharges, or 4 blooms, or 10 overloads. The way Hoyo's trying to make its units, chief among them being the non-cry characters, is by making them personal DPS units who specialize in elemental reactions, essentially turning them into hybrids. Once again, the stuff they brought into the game like Lauma's Elemental Burst or the Moonsign Benedictions are great for pushing the limits of reactions, but there's still the central issue of reactions not being based on the characters themselves and therefore always being at risk of getting outscaled eventually, in turn causing these units to be at risk of falling off quickly if and when personal DPS begins to catch up again. As it currently stands, elemental reactions are handicapped by their disassociation from the triggering unit's own stats, effectively meaning we cannot strengthen them as easily as we can personal damage. Likewise, characters who play into reactions, even if they do carry personal damage like Flins and Nefer, are basically pouring water into a bucket with a hole in the bottom. They are actively hurting themselves by having parts of their kit play into reactions for the sheer fact that reactions themselves are not characters we can invest in. They're a separate source with a limited amount of ways to be augmented. Hypothetically speaking, if let's say we had another Electro unit come out with the same power level as Flins, only instead of playing into Lunar Charge, this character was just an Unga Bunga attacker like Vars, that character will 100% outscale Flins in the long run purely because they can get more value from future hypercarry supports than Flins can. I'm not saying this to imply Flins is a bad character, far from it, he's an excellent unit, so are all the other non-cry units we have thus far. Nefer is an incredible amount of personal damage in conjunction with their ability to get more damage into reactions. But simply because a part of her is connected to reactions that she becomes a high-risk unit. Try to imagine it like this. Personal DPS is like a slow and steady line trending upwards. It may not move that quickly, but its trajectory is always going upwards. Reactions are more like a flight of stairs. They flatline for a period of time and then get a huge wave of support to boost upwards. But this way of going about power scaling is not only unpredictable, it's also unhealthy. You're effectively obligated to throw out your old characters and get new ones, whereas personal DPS characters, whether old or new, can all benefit from new support coming in. The reason Hu Tao held on for so long, meanwhile someone like Nahida fell off in such a short time despite being higher than Hu Tao in value at one point, was because anytime someone came out with a buff to personal damage, Xinyun, Farina, Shilon and what have you, Hu Tao was able to capitalize on it, whereas someone like Nahida could not. The arrival of Lauma signals the death of all Dendro units that came before her, since none of them can empower Dendro reactions while she can. Similarly, the arrival of Ineffa and Flins marks the death of all Electro units that came before them, since none of them can benefit from anything that they provide, only they can and likely the ones who come after. Since there's no way to naturally vertical invest into elemental reactions, all you can do is artificially vertical invest into them with these units, which also means in the foreseeable future, if new units come out with even better amps to reactions, they will directly power creep non-cry out of the metagame. Personal damage gets universally raised because everyone levels up from the inclusion of a certain buffer. It's not like Escoffier only helps out Skirk, she also retroactively helped out every other cryo DPS unit in the game. Someone like Lauma on the other hand buffs Dendro damage, but she doesn't buff the personal capabilities of past Dendro units, thereby making it one-sided if that makes sense. Altogether, Genshin's back to a reaction-centric meta, and while it is cool to see transformative reactions make a return to form through non-cry's new mechanics, I'm a bit concerned about the metaphorical sword of Damocles hanging above them. They're strong right now, yes, and by the looks of it they seem to be relatively future-proof. But if you think about it, we said the same thing for Alhaitham and Nahida back in version 3. We thought they were going to stay top tier for years and years. Look what happened. Hoyo needs to make elemental reactions vertically investable in a universal way. Otherwise, non-cry units might low-key fall off before Nanland units do. What do you guys think about this though? Do you think I'm being overly pessimistic or do you agree with my points? Let me know in the comments down below. That'll be all for today, so if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other Genshin Impact discussion videos if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.